Today, we're diving deep into the gritty reality of what it actually took to survive when armies clashed with sword and shield, when the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel determined the fate of kingdoms. This isn't your typical Hollywood romanticized version of medieval combat. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about how ordinary people managed to live through some of the most violent encounters in human history. We'll explore everything from the moment you first hear the war horns echoing across the valley to the chaotic aftermath when the dust finally settles and you're desperately hoping you're still breathing. The medieval battlefield was perhaps the most dangerous place a human being could find themselves, where death could come from a dozen different directions in the span of a heartbeat, where the difference between victory and defeat often came down to split-second decisions, superior positioning, and sometimes just pure dumb luck. But here's the thing that most people don't realize about medieval warfare. It wasn't just about being the strongest or most skilled fighter. Survival depended on understanding the complex web of tactics, psychology, equipment, and environmental factors that could either save your life or seal your doom. The knights in shining armor that dominate our popular imagination represented only a tiny fraction of medieval armies. The vast majority of fighters were common foot soldiers, peasants pressed into service, mercenaries fighting for coin, and militia members defending their homes. And these were the people who developed the most practical and effective survival strategies because they couldn't rely on expensive armor or years of professional training. Before we dive into the specifics of battlefield survival, we need to understand what you're actually facing when two medieval armies meet in combat, because the scale and chaos of these encounters was unlike anything in the modern world. Picture this: thousands of men packed together in formations that stretched across miles of terrain, the air thick with dust and smoke, the ground trembling under the weight of cavalry charges. The first and most crucial survival principle is understanding that medieval battles weren't the organized dueling matches you see in movies. They were chaotic melees where confusion reigned supreme, and most participants had only a vague idea of what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. Your survival begins long before the first sword is drawn. It starts with preparation, both mental and physical, because the soldiers who lived to fight another day were those who understood that battles are won and lost in the mind as much as with weapons. Mental preparation meant accepting the reality that you were probably going to see things that would haunt you for the rest of your life, that friends and comrades would fall beside you, that the person trying to kill you was probably just as terrified as you were, and that panic was your greatest enemy because it would cloud your judgment when clear thinking was literally a matter of life and death. Physical preparation involved understanding your equipment inside and out, knowing exactly how your weapons felt in your hands, how your armor restricted your movement, how much you could exert yourself before exhaustion became a fatal weakness, and most importantly, developing the muscle memory that would let you react instinctively when there wasn't time to think. The night before battle was crucial for survival. Experienced soldiers knew to get as much rest as possible despite the fear and anticipation, to eat well because it might be their last meal for a while, to check and double-check their equipment for any weakness that could fail at the worst possible moment, and to make peace with whatever gods they worshipped because tomorrow was far from guaranteed. When dawn breaks on the day of battle, your survival depends on staying with your unit at all costs because isolation on a medieval battlefield was almost always a death sentence. The buddy system wasn't just recommended, it was absolutely essential for staying alive. Your fellow soldiers weren't just companions, they were your shield wall, your early warning system, your backup when you stumbled, and your lifeline when everything went wrong, which it inevitably would. Understanding formations was critical because these weren't arbitrary arrangements. They were carefully designed systems that maximized your chances of survival while maximizing the enemy's chances of dying, and breaking formation was one of the fastest ways to get yourself and your comrades killed. The shield wall, used by Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and many other medieval armies, was perhaps the most effective defensive formation ever devised, where each warrior's shield overlapped with his neighbor's, creating an almost impenetrable barrier against enemy attacks. But this only worked if everyone held their position and trusted their comrades to do the same. If you found yourself in a shield wall, your survival depended on maintaining the integrity of the formation, keeping your shield up and locked with your neighbors, using short stabbing motions with your spear or sword rather than wild swings that would expose gaps in the wall, and watching for the telltale signs that the formation was about to collapse so you could prepare for the transition to individual combat. The moment a shield wall broke was often the moment when battles were decided, because once the protective formation collapsed, individual warriors became vulnerable to being surrounded and overwhelmed by multiple enemies. Spear combat dominated medieval battlefields because spears were cheaper to produce than swords, easier to learn, and devastatingly effective when used properly, especially in formation fighting, where the reach advantage could keep enemies at a safe distance. If you're armed with a spear, your survival strategy revolves around maintaining proper distance, using the weapon's length to keep multiple enemies at bay, aiming for center mass rather than trying for fancy targeted strikes, and always having a backup weapon ready because spears break, get stuck in shields, or become unwieldy in close quarters combat. The key to surviving spear combat was understanding that it was primarily a thrusting weapon, not a slashing one, and that your footwork was just as important as your arm strength, because good positioning could mean the difference between delivering a killing blow and leaving yourself open to counterattack. Archery transformed medieval warfare and created entirely new survival challenges, because arrows could kill you from hundreds of yards away without warning, making traditional concepts of safe distance meaningless. When facing archer volleys, your survival depended on recognizing the signs of an incoming barrage, the distinctive sound of bowstrings releasing in unison, the temporary darkening of the sky as hundreds of arrows reached their apex, and the brief moment you had to take cover or raise your shield before death rained down from above. Experienced soldiers learned to read the battlefield for cover opportunities, natural depressions in the ground, abandoned equipment, fallen horses, anything that could provide protection from arrow storms, and they developed an almost supernatural awareness of the rhythm of archery attacks because archers needed time to knock, draw, and loose their arrows, creating brief windows of opportunity for advancement. If you were unfortunate enough to be caught in the open during an arrow barrage, survival meant making yourself the smallest possible target, crouching low with your shield overhead, moving in unpredictable patterns if you had to move at all, and praying to whatever deity you favored, because sometimes divine intervention was the only thing standing between you and a very painful death. Cavalry charges represented perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval warfare. Thousands of pounds of horse and rider thundering toward you at speeds that made evasion nearly impossible. But understanding how to survive these encounters could mean the difference between being trampled into the mud and living to fight another day. The key to surviving a cavalry charge was understanding that horses, despite their training, were still animals with strong self-preservation instincts, and they would not willingly charge into a solid wall of spear points or other obstacles that threatened their safety. Effective anti-cavalry tactics involve creating dense formations of spearmen with their weapons angled upward to present an impenetrable hedge of steel points, using terrain features like ditches, stakes, or rough ground that would break up the charge, and maintaining discipline because breaking ranks in the face of charging cavalry was almost always fatal. If you found yourself isolated when cavalry approached, your only hope was finding terrain that horses couldn't navigate, steep slopes, dense woods, marshy ground, or structures that could provide protection, because trying to outrun a horse in open ground was a fool's errand that would only delay the inevitable. The reality of mounted combat was that knights and men-at-arms on horseback had significant advantages in reach, momentum, and psychological impact, but they were also vulnerable to certain tactics and environmental factors that infantry could exploit for survival. When facing mounted opponents, survival meant staying low to make yourself a harder target, using the horse's blind spots to your advantage, targeting the mount rather than the heavily armored rider when possible, and understanding that unhorsed cavalry were often more vulnerable than regular infantry because their equipment was optimized for mounted combat. Hand-to-hand combat was where medieval battles were ultimately decided, and surviving these personal encounters required a completely different set of skills and strategies than formation fighting. The first rule of individual combat survival was avoiding fair fights whenever possible, because honor was a luxury that dead men couldn't afford, and any advantage you could gain through positioning, terrain, surprise, or superior equipment should be exploited ruthlessly. When you found yourself in single combat, survival depended on reading your opponent quickly, assessing their equipment, stance, and apparent skill level, looking for signs of fatigue, injury, or psychological weakness that could be exploited. The most experienced fighters knew that medieval combat was as much about endurance and patience as it was about aggression, because the warrior who maintained their composure and conserved their energy often outlasted more aggressive opponents who exhausted themselves early in the fight. Weapon choice played a crucial role in survival, and understanding the strengths and limitations of different weapons could mean the difference between victory and defeat in personal combat. Swords, despite their iconic status, were actually backup weapons for most medieval warriors, expensive to produce and maintain, requiring extensive training to use effectively, and less versatile than many people assume. If you found yourself armed with a sword, survival meant understanding that it was primarily a cutting weapon designed for unarmored or lightly armored opponents, that thrusting attacks were often more effective than slashing ones, and that the weapon's balance and weight distribution affected both offensive capability and defensive options. Axes offered tremendous cutting power and could be devastating against both armor and shields, but they were slower to recover from missed swings and could become stuck in enemy equipment or bodies, leaving you temporarily vulnerable to counterattack. Maces and warhammers were specifically designed to deal with heavily armored opponents, concentrating tremendous force into a small impact area that could crush armor and break bones even through steel protection, but they required precise timing and positioning to be effective. The reality of armor in medieval combat was far more complex than most people realize, because while it provided excellent protection against many types of attacks, it also created vulnerabilities and limitations that smart opponents could exploit for survival advantage. If you were fortunate enough to have access to good armor, survival meant understanding its limitations as well as its strengths, knowing that joints and gaps in coverage were natural target areas for enemies, that mobility was reduced and fatigue increased, and that overheating could become a serious problem during extended combat. Fighting against armored opponents when you lack similar protection required different tactics entirely, focusing on attacks against unprotected areas, using weapons designed to penetrate or bypass armor, and exploiting the reduced mobility and endurance that armor imposed on your enemies. The psychological aspects of medieval combat were just as important as the physical ones, because battles were won and lost in the mind as much as with weapons, and understanding how to maintain your mental edge while exploiting your opponent's psychological weaknesses could be the key to survival. Fear was the constant companion of every medieval warrior, and learning to function effectively despite overwhelming terror was perhaps the most important survival skill of all. Experienced fighters developed techniques for managing fear, focusing on specific tasks rather than dwelling on the overall danger, using controlled breathing to maintain composure, drawing strength from comrades and shared purpose, and channeling fear into heightened awareness rather than paralyzing panic. Battle fury or berserker rage was a double-edged sword that could provide tremendous advantages in combat, but also created serious vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Warriors who gave in to complete rage often fought with supernatural ferocity and seemed immune to pain and fatigue, but they also lost tactical awareness, made poor decisions, and were vulnerable to clever opponents who could exploit their lack of control. The key to survival was finding the balance between controlled aggression that enhanced performance and uncontrolled fury that compromised judgment and tactical awareness. Recognizing when a battle was lost and knowing how to execute a strategic withdrawal was crucial for long-term survival, because even the bravest warrior was of no use to anyone if they died in a hopeless cause. Reading the signs of impending defeat, noticing when formations were collapsing, when morale was breaking, when the tide of battle had turned irreversibly, could mean the difference between fighting another day and becoming another casualty statistic. Organized retreats were far safer than chaotic routes, because disciplined withdrawal under cover of rearguard actions provided much better survival odds than every man for himself panic that left individual warriors vulnerable to cavalry pursuit and systematic slaughter. If you found yourself in a retreating army, survival meant staying with organized units if possible, avoiding the temptation to discard equipment that might seem burdensome but could save your life later, and understanding that the greatest danger often came after the main battle was over, during the pursuit phase when victorious enemies hunted down fleeing survivors. Knowing the terrain was absolutely crucial for survival because the landscape itself could be your greatest ally or your worst enemy, depending on how well you understood and utilized environmental factors. High ground provided significant tactical advantages, better visibility of enemy movements, improved defensive positions, and psychological benefits that could tip the balance in close encounters. Dense forests could provide cover from archery and break up cavalry charges, but they also limited visibility and made formation fighting nearly impossible, requiring different survival strategies based on individual combat skills rather than group tactics. Rivers, marshes, and other water features created both opportunities and hazards, potentially channeling enemy movements into predictable patterns while also creating obstacles that could trap retreating forces. Weather conditions had profound effects on medieval battles and created unique survival challenges that smart warriors learned to anticipate and exploit. Rain turned battlefields into muddy quagmires that favored infantry over cavalry, made archery less effective due to wet bowstrings and reduced visibility, and created opportunities for ambushes and surprise attacks that weren't possible in clear conditions. Snow and cold weather favored armies that were better prepared for harsh conditions, created opportunities for winter campaigns that caught enemies off guard, and made hypothermia and frostbite serious concerns that could kill warriors as effectively as enemy weapons. Hot weather created different challenges, increasing the risk of heat exhaustion and dehydration, making heavy armor nearly unbearable for extended periods, and favoring lighter equipped forces that could maintain mobility and endurance longer than heavily armored opponents. Understanding logistics and supply lines was crucial for survival, because armies that couldn't feed themselves were armies that couldn't fight effectively, and individual warriors needed to understand how their personal supply needs fit into the larger strategic picture. Food and water were constant concerns for medieval armies because preserving perishable supplies during long campaigns was extremely difficult with the technology available, and armies that outran their supply lines often found themselves weakened by hunger and disease long before they faced enemy weapons. Personal equipment maintenance was a survival skill that many modern people underestimate because weapons and armor that weren't properly maintained would fail at the worst possible moments, potentially turning victory into defeat or survival into death. Knowing how to sharpen weapons, repair armor, treat leather goods, and maintain equipment in field conditions could mean the difference between having reliable gear when you needed it most and finding yourself defensively naked at the moment of truth. Medical knowledge was incredibly important for survival because even minor wounds could become infected and fatal if not treated properly, and understanding basic field medicine could save your life or the lives of your comrades. Medieval armies had limited medical resources compared to modern standards, so individual warriors needed to understand basic wound treatment, infection prevention, and emergency first aid that could keep them alive long enough to receive proper medical attention. Recognizing the signs of serious internal injuries, blood loss, and shock could help you make informed decisions about whether to continue fighting or seek immediate medical assistance. Disease was actually a bigger killer than combat in most medieval military campaigns because poor sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and close quarters living conditions created perfect environments for epidemic diseases that could devastate entire armies. Personal hygiene and disease prevention were crucial survival skills that smart warriors prioritized even when water was scarce and time was limited, because staying healthy was just as important as staying alive in combat. Understanding the signs of common military diseases like dysentery, typhus, and plague could help you take preventive measures or seek treatment before these conditions became fatal. The aftermath of battle was often just as dangerous as the fighting itself, because victorious armies frequently engaged in systematic looting and killing of wounded enemies, making survival dependent on appearing either dead, valuable as a prisoner, or too dangerous to approach casually. If you were wounded but conscious after a battle, survival might depend on playing dead until the immediate danger passed, then seeking help from friendly forces or civilians who might provide medical assistance. Understanding the rules of medieval warfare regarding prisoners, ransom, and the treatment of defeated enemies could literally mean the difference between life and death if you found yourself at the mercy of victorious opponents. Noble prisoners were often valuable for ransom and might expect relatively humane treatment, but common soldiers had no such protection and might be killed out of hand or enslaved depending on the customs and desperation of their captors. The role of leadership in medieval battles cannot be overstated because armies with competent commanders had dramatically better survival rates than those led by incompetent or inexperienced leaders who made tactical blunders that got their men killed unnecessarily. If you found yourself serving under good leadership, survival meant following orders even when they seemed counterintuitive, trusting in the tactical knowledge of experienced commanders, and maintaining discipline even under extreme stress. Poor leadership created its own survival challenges because incompetent commanders often issued contradictory orders, failed to provide adequate supplies or support, and made strategic decisions that put their troops in impossible situations. Learning to recognize the difference between good and bad leadership could help you make informed decisions about when to follow orders blindly and when subtle disobedience might be necessary for survival. The social aspects of medieval military service created both opportunities and hazards for individual survival, because the relationships you formed with fellow warriors could determine whether you received help when you needed it most or found yourself abandoned in critical moments. Building trust and mutual support relationships with your comrades was essential for survival, because medieval warfare was fundamentally a team effort where individual heroics were less important than group cohesion and mutual protection. Understanding military hierarchy and knowing how to navigate the complex social relationships within medieval armies could help you avoid conflicts that might compromise your safety or effectiveness in combat. Religion played a significant role in medieval warfare in individual survival, not just in terms of providing psychological comfort and motivation, but in practical ways that affected everything from medical treatment to prisoner exchange. Understanding the religious beliefs and customs of both your own forces and your enemies could help you anticipate behavior patterns, exploit psychological advantages, and potentially save your life if you were captured or wounded. The transition from battle to post-battle activities required its own set of survival skills because the immediate aftermath of combat was often chaotic and dangerous in ways that were different from, but no less deadly than the fighting itself. Knowing how to identify and avoid continued dangers, locate friendly forces, assess your own condition and that of your comrades, secure necessary supplies, and begin the process of recovery and reorganization was crucial for long-term survival. Understanding how to properly search battlefields for useful equipment while avoiding booby traps, unstable structures, and other hazards could mean the difference between improving your survival prospects and walking into deadly situations. The psychological aftermath of medieval battles created long-term survival challenges that are often overlooked in discussions of medieval warfare, because the mental trauma of combat could affect decision-making, judgment, and effectiveness in ways that made future survival more difficult. Learning to cope with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, dealing with survivor guilt, processing the violence and horror of medieval combat, and maintaining the mental resilience necessary for continued military service were all crucial skills for warriors who expected to fight in multiple campaigns. Developing healthy coping mechanisms and support systems that could help you deal with the psychological impact of warfare was just as important as learning weapon techniques and tactical knowledge. In conclusion, surviving a medieval battle required a complex combination of physical skills, tactical knowledge, psychological resilience, and social awareness that went far beyond the simple sword-fighting abilities that dominate popular portrayals of medieval warfare. The warriors who lived to fight another day were those who understood that survival was a comprehensive discipline that began long before the fighting started and continued long after the last sword was sheathed. They were students of human nature as much as students of warfare, understanding that battles were won and lost in the mind as much as with weapons, and that the key to long-term survival was developing a complete skill set that could adapt to the constantly changing demands of medieval military life. Whether you were a professional knight with years of training and expensive equipment, or a common foot soldier pressed into service with minimal preparation, your survival depended on understanding these fundamental principles and applying them with intelligence, courage, and determination in the face of overwhelming danger and uncertainty. The medieval battlefield was unforgiving, but it was not random. Those who understood its rules, respected its dangers, and prepared themselves thoroughly had the best chance of living to see another dawn. Remember, in medieval warfare, the smartest warrior was often the one who survived, not necessarily the bravest or strongest. Knowledge, preparation, and tactical thinking were your best weapons against the chaos and violence of medieval combat.